The movement of my foot had drawn him. He leapt at the toe of my shoe, fell off, and went back disconsolately towards the water, passing another aspirant who was hurrying forward, gay with a bit of weed round its neck. Meanwhile, the race was continuing. The steed was walking and hopping forward with her double load. During one of her pauses, the fourth frog sprang, receiving from the green rival a quiet, sure kick in the throat which laid him out, but picking himself up he tried again. The original jockey sat still, croaking weakly, vainly for motion, but the green super-jockey, the line of whose back was now almost oval with the strain of throttling, kicked out again at a fresh aspirant and missed. Immediately the aspirant gripped his leg and hung on, while the steed moved forward a few more paces. During the next interval, the aspirant managed to grip the other leg of the green super-jockey, and, stepping up on the wide haunches of the female, secured what may have given a satisfying illusion of superiority. It was no longer a race. It was an omnibus. The omnibus progressed unevenly, with noises like the tooting of horns blown asthmatically. It had 4 pairs of protuberant headlights, the reflectors of which glinted in the sun. It appeared to have been broken down completely, so I left it, having other business with a raven's nest on the headland. I climbed over the stone dam, jumping down to a place out of the wind, pleasantly warmed by the sun. I was now hidden from the waiting heron by a screen of ash boughs cut and laid along the top of the bank. Shoots and twigs growing upright gave cover for my head as I peered under a horizontal grey bough. The heron was still standing in the farther field, among last year's thistle stalks and grass clumps, its head held high and anxious. It was doubtful if it had the sense of continuity, that it would remember I had not reappeared. I had been standing there for about a minute when rustlings and small thumpings became audible in the bank with the squeaks of rats. I had forgotten the rats. Were they fighting over the frog brought into the tunnels when first I had sat by the pond? I listened, keeping still, and peering over the dam I saw a rat running along the side of the pond, followed by 2 other rats. They made straight for the omnibus, still in the attitude of breakdown, and through my glass I watched 2 rats pulling the frogs apart. The jockey, the green super-jockey, and the aspirant hung on to each other, kicking and croaking, but the rats, the zestful and murderous rats, braced their hind legs and bit and tugged. The aspirant was the first to go. He was dragged immediately along the path to the hole. Vainly the green super-jockey croaked for speed. He was nipped by a leg, but the strength of 2 tugging rats could not shift him. After a while, for a minute I should think, the rats ceased to pull each for himself. They appeared to organize themselves and set about removing the omnibus as it stood. Each with a leg in its mouth and with heads held high, they trotted along the bank, sharing the weight of muscled frog flesh. Another rat ran to meet them, and yet another. There was a squeak and scuffle, and the newcomers ran on, plainly told to mind their own affairs. They ran to the water, where, putting their heads down, they swam under like small, unskilful otters. Squeaks inside the bank told me that the rats had entered with their booty, and I remained there, hoping to get a glimpse of them, for there were many rabbit holes in the bank. Noises of tugging and thumping came with more squeaks out of a low tunnel, and, tiring of my position, I stood upright again to watch the swimming rats. Long, thin legs and wide grey wings upheld and dropping, blurred in the retina of my eye. The heron had flown back to the pond. It folded its wings while raising its head and looking round for movement that might mean danger. Knowing how keen was the sight of this shy bird, I tried not to blink an eyelid, for the section of my face under the laid ash bough was silhouetted from the heron's point of view against the sky. Suddenly the heron lowered its beak. I saw a rat swimming across the pond, its whiskered head exposed with something unwieldy before it. It was carrying a frog. The heron's body, seeming so loose and thin within the shell of soft grey wings, their big flight quills tipped with black, seemed to stiffen and sharpen, It moved head and neck, low and forward, an unobtrusive action against the background of its body. The rat could not have seen it, for it swam on steadily until it was within 20 inches of the heron's sharp beak, when the beak struck and the rat was lifted out of the water. It squealed and twisted, its feet ran on air, its tail whipped its body. The heron turned round to strike it on the bank, but its beak was wedged in the rat's skull. It lifted a long leg and tried to claw it with its toes, and the weight of the rat and the wind caused it to stagger. Then the heron saw my eyes under the bough of the ash tree and jumped into the air with fright. It flapped and tumbled, but before I had time to clamber over the bank it had recovered and was steady on the wing. In the air it clawed its beak again, and the rat fell with a splash into the water. When I reached the bank opposite the splash, I saw a dead rat floating in the wavelets, with a jockey already riding on its shoulders, croaking defiance to another, whose head, set with glazed and bulging eyes, was poked up alongside. The next story is called The Heller. In March, the high spring tides lap with their ragged and undulating riband of flotsam the grasses near the top of the sea-wall, and once in a score of years the southwest gale piles the sea in the estuary so high that it lops over the bank and rushes down to the reclaimed grazing marsh within. The landlocked water returns on the ebb by way of the reedy dikes, through the culverts under the wall with their one-way hinged wooden doors, and by the muddy channels to the sea again. I was unfortunate enough to miss seeing such a flood following the great gale, when many big trees, most of them elms, but not a few beech and oak, went down. But hearing of it, I went down to the marsh the next afternoon, before the time of high tide, hoping to see the water brimming over again. I wandered along the sea-wall, where the hoof-holed path of clay still held sea-water, as far as the black hospital ship Niphon, and then I returned. The gale had blown itself out. A blue sky lay beyond Hartland Point, far out over the calm Atlantic. There is a slanting path leading to the road below by the marshman's cottage, and by this I left the wide prospect seen from the sea-wall. Just beyond the cottage there was the slightest dip in the sea-wall, and just before descending I noticed that the grasses down the inner slope were washed flat and straggly by a heavy overflooding of the day before. The marshman was standing in the porch of the cottage looking at his ducklings, which had hatched about a fortnight before. He wore his spectacles and had a book in his hands. We greeted each other, and I stopped to talk. I always enjoyed talking with the marshman. His face pleased me. I liked his kind brown eyes, his grey hair, his small and intelligent sea-browned face. His dog had recently been kicked by a bullock and had a broken leg which the marshman had set with a wooden splint. This knocked on the ground as the dog trotted about with apparent ease. The marshman was a skilful man. I remembered how he had saved the life of a sheep the year before, when it was staggering crazily because, said the marshman, it had a worm in its brain. The marshman had held the sheep's head between his knees, cut a hole in its skull with a knife, and drawn out the tapeworm by suction through a quill cut from the pinion feather of a goose. It was an even chance, for most sheep so afflicted have to be destroyed. This ewe got well, but the story is about the mysterious loss of the marshman's ducklings, not of mutton. In a soft voice he began telling me about the book in his hands, which he said was wonderful and most interesting. It was thick and heavy and printed in small, close-set type. It was The History of the Jews, and the marshman had been reading it with the same care and patience with which, year after year, he had cut the reeds in the dikes and scythed the thistles in the rank grass. For years he had been reading that book, and he had not yet reached the middle pages. Would I like to take the book home with me and have a read of it? He was a bit busy just now and could easily spare it for a day or two. I was quite welcome to take it if... I was saved from a reply by the sudden change in the marshman's face. He was staring intently beyond the gate by which we stood. His spectacles were pushed back from his eyes. I looked in the direction of his stare and saw the usual scene: fowls on the stony and feathery road, and a couple of pigs nosing amidst them, the down-hanging branches of the willow tree over the dyke, the green pointed leaves of the flag iris rising thickly along both banks, the sky gleams between them. On the water a brood of yellowish-white ducklings were paddling, watched anxiously from the road by the hen that had hatched them. "The heller!" At the muttered angry words, the marshman's dog, which had assumed a stiff attitude from the moment of his master's fixed interest in something as yet unsmelled, unseen, and unheard by itself, whined and crouched and sprang over the gate. It had gone a few yards, sending the hens clucking and flying in all directions, when the marshman shouted. Seeing its master's arm flung to the left, the dog promptly turned in that direction. I saw its hackles rise. The narrow dyke, which brought fresh drinking water to the grazing marsh, was crossed under the willow tree by a clammer, or single heavy plank of elm wood. As the dog ran on to the clammer, I saw something at the farther end slide into the water. I had a fleeting impression of the vanishing hindquarters of a squat and slender dog, dark brown as a bulrush, and with the palms of feet widely webbed as a duck's. It had a long tail tapering to a point. The brown tail slid over the plank flatly yet swiftly, and disappeared without splash into the slight ripple made by the submerging animal. "'Tis that darned old mousy-coloured fitch," grumbled the marshman, opening the gate. "It be after my ducklings. It took one just about this time yesterday. You're a ship," to the dog. "Fetchin', ship." The dog sprang around, barking raucously, and trotted along the plank again, nose between paws, and whining with excitement where the otter had stood. Then it looked at its master and barked at the water. While it was barking, the ducklings, about 15 yards away, began to run on the water, beating their little fluky stumps of wings and stretching out their necks. "Queep, queep, queep," they cried. The foster hen on the bank was clucking and jerking her comb about in agitation. "Ah, you heller, you!" cried the marshman, as a duckling was drawn under by invisible jaws. The other ducklings waddled out by the brimming edge of the road, made for the hen in 2 files of uniform and tiny yellowish bodies, aslant with straining to reach the cover of wings. Very red and jerky about the comb and cheek pendules, with flickering eyes, this motherly fowl quatted on the stones, and lowered her wings till they rested on her useless pinion shafts, and fluffed out her feathers to make room for the 8 mites, which, in spite of her constant calls and entreaties, would persist in walking on that cold and unwalkable place which was only for sipping from at the edge. Beep, beep, beep. "Queep, queep," whistled the ducklings drowsily in their sweet and feeble voices. The marshman came out of the cottages with a gun. "The heller," he said, "the withering beast that ought to be kicked to flames." He waited 5 minutes, watching the water where the duckling had gone down. Parallel lines of ripples, wavering with infirm and milk-white sky, rode along the brimming water. The tide was still rising. 20 yards away, the young, strong leaves of the flag irises began to quiver. The marshman lifted the gun and curled a finger round the trigger. The leaves were still. We waited. The peep-peeps of the happy ducklings ceased. Water began to run in sudden starts around the smoothed stones in the roadway. The tide was rising fast. A feather was carried twirling on a runnel that stopped by my left toe, and after a pause it ran on a few inches, leaving dry specks of dust and bud sheaths tacked to the welt. The outline of the dyke was lost in the overbrimming of the water. Grasses began to float and stray at its edges. The runnels curiously explored the least hollow, running forward, pausing, turning sideways or backwards, and blending as though gladly with one another. "It be gone," said the Marshman, lowering the gun, to my relief, for its double barrels had been near my cheek, and they were rusty, thin as an eggshell at the muzzle, and loaded with an assortment of broken screw-heads, nuts, and odd bits of iron. He was as economical with his shooting as he was with his reading. Originally the gun had been a flintlock, owned by his great-grandfather, and his father had had it converted into a percussion cap. Its walnut stock was riddled with wormholes, and even as I was examining it I heard the sound like the ticking of a watch, which ceased after 9 ticks, the death-watch beetle. It was doubtful which would go first, the stock, falling abroad in its tunnelled brittleness, or the barrels bursting from frail old age. "It's a high spring tide," I said, stepping farther back. "I suppose the otter came up on it and down the dike." Then the Marshman told me about the Heller. We stood with our backs to the deep and ancient thorn hedge that borders the road to the east, a hedge double-sheared by wind and man, 6 feet high and 8 feet thick, and so matted that a man could walk along it without his boots sinking. It was grey and gold with lichens. I had always admired the hedge by the marsh toll-gate. I leaned gingerly against it while the Marshman told me that he had seen the otter on the 2 afternoons previously, and both times when the tide was nearly on the top of the flood. No, it did not come up to the dike. It was a bold beast, and came over the sea wall, where the tide had poured over 2 afternoons agone. "My wife seed un rinning over the wall like a little brown dog. I reckon myself the Heller comes from the duck ponds over in Hainton Marsh, and sleeps by day in the daggers. Otters be always travelling up the pill for to get to the duck ponds, or going on up to the pill head and over the basin of the weir into fresh water after trout. Never before have I heard tell of an otter going time after time, and by day too, after the same ducklings. 'Tis most unusual, sir, for an otter will always take fish when he can get fish, eels particularly, and there be plenty of eels all over the marsh. An otter loveth an eel. 'Tis its most natural food, in a manner of speaking. 'Tis what is called an ambulance baste, the otter be. Yes, 'tis like a crab that can live in both land and water. A proper ambulance baste it be. A most interesting baste for those that possess the education for to study up all that sort of thing. Now, can 'ee tell me how an otter serves an eel different from another fish? Other fish, leastways those I've seen with my own eyes, are 8 head downwards, but an eel be 8 tail first, and the head and shoulders be left. I've seen scores of eels, and all 8 tail first." While the old fellow was speaking, the water, in irregular pourings and innocent swirls, was stealing right across the road. It reached the hen, who, to judge from the downward pose of her head, regarded it as a nuisance. A runnel slipped stealthily between her cane-coloured feet, wetting the claws worn with faithful scratching for the young. She arose and strutted away in the lee of the hedge, calling her brood, and "Wuk, wuk, wuk!" she cried, for with tiny notes of glee the ducklings had headed straight for the wide water gleaming with the early sunset. The Marshman said, "Darn the flood!" for the history of the Jews, container of future years' laborious pleasure, lay in a plash by the gate 10 strides away. He picked it up, regarding ruefully the dripping cover. He was saying that it wasn't no odds a bit of damp on the outside, when I noticed a small travelling ripple in the shape of an arrow moving out from the plank, now almost awash. It continued steadily for about 3 yards from the plank, and then the arrowhead ceased to push. Ripples spread out slowly, and beyond the ripples a line of bubbles like shot began to rise and lie still. The line, increasing steadily by lengths varying from 2 or 3 to a dozen inches, drew out towards the ducklings. I took long strides forward beside the Marshman. Our footfalls splashed in the shallow water. The dog trotted at his heels, quivering, his ears cocked. A swirl arose in the leat and rocked the ducklings. They cried and struck out for the grass, but one stayed still, trying to rise on weeny wings, and then it went under. "The heller!" cried the Marshman, raising his gun. For about 20 seconds we waited. A brown, whiskered head, flat and seal-like, with short rough hairs and beady black eyes, looked out of the water. Bang! It dived at the flash, and although we peered and waited for at least a minute after the whining of a screw-head ricocheting away over the marsh had ceased, I saw only our spectral faces shaking in the water. The next afternoon I went down by the eastern sea-wall and lay on the flat, grassy ridge, with a view of the lower end of the Ram's Horn duck pond. Wildfowl were flying round the marsh and settling on the open water, hidden between the thick green reeds. Many scores had their nests in the preserve. Why did the otter, I wondered, come all the way to the dike, when it could take all the ducklings it wanted in the pond? Perhaps in my reasoning I was falling into the old error of ascribing to a wild beast something of human reasoning. For had I been an otter after ducklings, I should certainly have stayed where they were most numerous. The tide flowed past me with its usual straggle of froth, covering the flotsam of corks, bottles, clinker, spruce bark from the Bideford shipyards, tins, cabbage leaves, and sticks. The murky water moved wide and deep between the muddy glidders. 2 ketches rode up on the flood, the exhausts of their oil engines echoing with hollow thuds over the mud and water. I wondered why they were wasting oil when the current was so swift to carry them. But when they made fast to their mooring buoys and the bows swung round, I realized the use of the engines, to keep them in the fairway, of course. Gulls screamed as they floated around the masts and cordage of the black craft, awaiting the dumping overboard of garbage. I waited for an hour, but saw nothing of the otter. "Did he see 'un?" asked the Marshman when I went back. His gun lay on the table, and Ship the dog was crouched over the threshold, nose on paws, pointing to the clammer bridge over the dike. "He's took another duckling," growled the man. The otter must have made an early crossing while I was lazing on the bank. Perhaps he had come through a culvert, squeezing past the sodden wooden trap, and then, either seeing or winding me, he had crossed under water. The Marshman, happening to come to the door, had seen the duckling going under, and although he had waited for 10 minutes, nothing had come up. "Ship here went nosing among the daggers, but couldn't even get wind of 'un. I reckon that ambulance baste can lie on the bottom and go to sleep if it has a mind to." By ambulance he meant amphibious, I imagined. An otter has no gills. It breathes in the ordinary way, being an animal that has learned to swim and hunt under water. "Didn't you even see a bubble?" "Not one." It seemed strange. Also, it had seemed strange that the engines of the ketches were wasting oil. That had a perfectly ordinary explanation when one realized it. "And it took a duck in just the same way as before?" "That's it. In a wink that duck went down under." "But didn't the ducklings see the otter?" "No, me. The poor little beauty was took quick as a wink." He was much upset by it. "Now I'll tell 'ee what I'll do," he said. "I'll till a gin for a rat, I will. And if I trap an otter, well, 'twill be a pity, as the otter-hunting gentry would say, but there 'tis." Otters were not generally trapped in the country of the Tor and Torridge rivers, as most of the water owners subscribed to the otter hounds. There were occasions, however, when a gin was tilled or set on a submerged rock, where an otter was known to touch, or on a sunken post driven into the river-bed near its holt. About once in a season the pack drew the brackish waters of the Ram's Horn duck pond, but an otter was very rarely killed there, as there was impregnable holding among the thick reeds. I looked at the Marshman's face, filled with grim thoughts about the heller. Had he got the term from the history of the Jews? and remembered how only the year before, when an otter had been killed near Braunton Church, he had confided to me that he didn't care much for otter hunting, that it was not much sport with all they girt dogs agin one small baste. "I've got some old rabbit gins," said the Marshman, "and I'll till them on the clammer and get that heller, I will." I went away to watch the mating flight of the golden plover over the marsh, and the sun had gone down behind the low line of the sandhills to the west when I returned along the sea wall. 3 rabbit gins, rusty affairs of open iron teeth and flat iron springs ready to snap and hold anything that trod on them, lay on the plank. The marshman had bound lengths of twisted brass rabbit wire around the plank and through the ends of the chains, so that, dragged into the dike, the weight of the 3 gins would drown the struggling otter. My road home lay along the edge of the dike, which was immediately under the sea-wall. Old upturned boats, rusty anchors, rotting bollards of tree trunks and other gear lay on the wall and its inner grassy slope. Near the pill head, the brown ribs of a ketch, almost broken up, lay above the wall. I came to the hump, where the road goes over the culvert. Leaning on the stone parapet, I watched the fresh water of the river moving with dark eddies under the fender into the dike, and the overflow tumbling into the concrete basin of the weir and sliding down the short length to the rising tide. It barely rippled. The air was still and clear, bright with eve star and crescent moon. The last cart had left the great field. The faint cries of lambs arose under the moon. Men were all home to their cottages or playing skittles in the village inns. Resting the weight of my body on the stone, I stared vaguely at the water, thinking how many strange impulses and feelings came helter-skelter out of a man, and how easy it was to judge him falsely by any one act or word. The marshman had pitied a hunted otter. He had raged against a hunting otter. He felt tenderly and protectively towards the ducklings. He would complacently wring their necks when the peas ripened and sell them for as much money as he could get for them. In the future he would not think otter hunting a cruel sport, and if the otter hunters heard that he had trapped and drowned an otter, they would be sincerely upset that it had suffered such a cruel and, as it were, an unfair death. Perhaps the only difference between animal and man was that the animal had fewer notions. I was musing in this idle manner, my thoughts slipping away as water, when I heard a sound somewhere behind me. It was a thin, piercing whistle, the cry of an otter. Slowly I moved back my head till only a part of my face would be visible in silhouette from the water below. I watched for a bubble, a sinuous shadow, an arrowy ripple, a swirl. I certainly did not expect to see a fat old dog otter come drifting down on his back, swishing with his rudder and bringing it down with great thwacking splashes on the water, while he chewed a half-pound trout held in his short forepaws. My breath ceased, my eyes held from blinking. I had a perfect view of his sturdy body, the yellowish-white patch of fur on his belly below his ribs, his sweeping whiskers, his dark eyes. Still chewing, he bumped head-on into the sill, kicked himself upright, walked on the concrete, and stood there crunching, while the 5 pools running from his legs and rudder ran into one. He did not chew as I had read in books of otters chewing. He just stood there on his 4 legs, the tail half of the trout sticking out of his mouth, and gulped down the bits. That trout had disappeared in about 10 seconds. Then the otter leaned down to the water and lapped, as a cat does. He was old, slow, coarse-haired, and about 30 pounds in weight, the biggest otter I had seen, with the broadest head. After quenching his thirst, he put his head and shoulders under water, holding himself from falling in by his stumpy webbed forefeet and his rudder, 18 inches long, pressing down straight behind. He was watching for fish, as though any fish remained in the water flow after that dreaded apparition had come splashing under the culvert. With the least ripple, he slid into the water. I breathed and blinked with relief, but dared not move otherwise. A head looked up almost immediately, and 2 dark eyes stared at me. The otter sneezed, shook the water out of his small ears, and sank away under. I expected it to be my last sight of the beast, and, leaning over to see if an arrowy ripple pointed upstream, I knocked a piece of loose stone off the parapet. To my amazement, he came up near the sill again with something in his mouth. He swung over on his back and bit it in play. He climbed onto the sill and dropped it there and slipped back into the water. It was the stone that had dropped from the parapet. I kept still. The otter reappeared with something white in his mouth. He dropped it with a tinkle beside the stone, and the tinkle must have pleased him, for he picked up the china sherd, it looked like part of a teacup with the handle, and rolled over with it in his paws. As in other Devon waters, the stream was a pitching place for cottage rubbish, and during the time I was standing by the parapet, watching the otter at his play, he had collected about a dozen objects: rusty salmon tins, bits of broken glass, sherds of clome, pitchers and jam jars, and 1/2 of a sheep's jaw. He ranged them on the sill of the weir, tapping the more musical with a paw, as a cat does, until they fell into the water, when he would dive for and retrieve them. At the end of about half an hour, the sea was lapping over the top of the sill and pressing under the fender. Soon the dike began to brim. The taste of salt water must have made the otter hungry again, or perhaps he had been waiting for the tide, for he left his playthings and, dropping into the water, went down the dike towards the marshman's cottage. I crept stealthily along the grassy border of the road, watching the arrowy ripple gleaming with the silver of the thin curved moon. The hillside, under the ruined chapel above the village of Braunton, began to show yellow speckles of light in the distant houses. The dike being deserted, for the brood of ducklings with their hen had been shut up for the night, why then that sudden swirl and commotion in the water by the flag irises, just where the ducklings had been taken before? Bubbles broke on the water in strings, big bubbles. Then something heaved, glimmering out of the leat, flapping and splashing violently. The noises ceased, and more bubbles came up. The water rocked. Suddenly the splashing increased, and seemed to be moving up and down the leat, breaking the surface of the water. Splashes wetted my face. A considerable struggle was going on there. After a minute there was a new noise, the noise of sappy stalks of the flags being broken, slap, slap, slap on the water. I saw streaks and spots of phosphorescence or moon gleams by the end of the plank. The flapping went on in the meadow beyond the flags with a sound of biting. I stood without moving for some minutes while the biting and squirming went on steadily. My shoes filled with water. The water had spread silently half across the road. Then the noises ceased. I heard a dull rap, as of something striking the heavy wooden plank under water, a strange noise of blowing, a jangle of iron and a heavy splash, and many bubbles and faint knocking sounds. The otter had stepped on the plank to drink and was trapped. At last the marshman, having closed the history of the Jews, placed his spectacles in their case, drawn on his boots, put on his coat, taken his gun off the nails on the ceiling beam, put it back for a fluke-spearing pronged fork in the corner, lit the hurricane lamp, said with grim triumph, "Now us will go over to see something." He was highly pleased that he had outwitted the otter. "There be no hurry, my dear," he said. "Give him plenty of time for to see the water for the last occasion in his skin." We stood for a while by the clamour under the dark and softly shivering leaves of the willow looming over us in the lamplight. The water had receded from the plank when the last feeble tug came along the brass wire. The marshman, watched by his dog hopping round and round on its wooden leg in immense excitement, pulled up the bundle of gins, and the sagging beast held to them by a forepaw. It was quite dead, but the Marshman decided to leave it there all night to make certain. "I see in the paper," he said, "that a chap up to Lunnon be giving good money for the best otter skins," tapping the spearing handle significantly with his hand. When it had been dropped in the water again, we went a few paces into the meadow with the lamp, and by its light we saw a conger eel, thick through as a man's arm, lying in the grass. The dark, living sinuousness was gone from it, and stooping we saw that it had been bitten through the tail. Suddenly I thought it must have come with the high spring tide over the sea-wall, and soon afterwards the keen-nosed otter, following eagerly the scent where it had squirmed and writhed its way in the grass. The conger had stayed in the dike, hiding in a drain by the flag irises and coming out when the colder salt water had drifted down. The Marshman carried it back to his cottage and cut it open, and then stared into my face with amazement and sadness, for within the great eel were the remains of his ducklings. The Yellow Boots. Unlike many hunts, the Inklefell harriers, who also hunted fox, held a meet on the day before their annual hunt ball and not the day after. The meet on the morning of the last hunt ball will be remembered long. The mounted followers and those on foot waited till midday, but no pack was led to the crossroads. The meet had been advertised in the local papers to be held at 11 o'clock. At 11:45, about 1/3 of the field, including every farmer, had gone homewards. A few minutes after noon, Jim Huggins rode up. He was the huntsman, an old and fog-seasoned man. In his high voice he said that he had been sent to say, with the master's compliments, that the meet was cancelled. That was all. In answer to questions, he made but one reply. "I don't know, s'm." It was his habit to address both ladies and gentlemen as "s'm." He never said "sir" or "ma'am." "But what's happened, Jim? Anything the matter with hounds?" He sat upright and still on his stocky bay cob. "I don't know, s'm." "But how extraordinary! Are they sick?" A week ago they had been fed on donkey flesh and had fought in the kennels all the way to the meet, and even when drawing covert. The unusual diet had been the cause of many jokes. "I don't know, s'm." "Is General Inklefell all right?" They walked their hunters nearer to him. They were made curious by his rigid reticence. "I don't know, s'm." He shifted slightly on his right thigh the angle of his whip. "You don't know? Haven't you seen the master this morning, Jim?" The kennels and the huntsman's cottage were in a wood 200 yards behind the manor. "Not this morning, s'm. Second footman came with the General's message, s'm." "Have you seen Miss Molly?" She was the honorary whipper-in to her father's hounds. "Not this morning, s'm." Jim, in his green cap and green coat, sat on his bay cob looking straight ahead, avoiding every eye. He was like a gnarled and mossy limb of one of the dwarf oaks of Wistman's Wood, trees rooted on Dartmoor, thick as they are tall, which were ancient before doomsday. The voice of a boy said timidly, "Please, sir, us didn't hear no dogs singing this morning." "Hold your rattle, young tacker," commanded Jim Huggins in the sharp, hound-rating voice he had not used since whiphood days. Only his jaw moved. The mist of breath vanished in the cold air. He looked at his horse's ears. People exchanged glances. The tacker was abashed. His father was a cowman on the home farm of the manor. He lived near the kennels, whence had come no singing of hounds that morning. "Good day, s'm," said Jim, raising his cap, laying the near rein on the horse's neck and pressing its off flank with his calf. The cob turned with smart obedience and trotted home. The word extraordinary was ejaculated by nearly everyone present in the saddle. That night, while people were arriving at the Bedford Hotel in Tavistock for the Hunt Ball, the secretary, Pops Russell, who often said that life would be a bore without hunting, billiards, and Bass's beer, was surrounded in the lounge by many black and pink and green-coated friends, to whom he told the astounding news that neither Bimbo nor Moll was coming that evening. "But, Pops, old man, what's up with Bimbo? What's all this mystery about?" Bimbo was the name by which the master was known to his friends. "Asked me to tell you he was awfully sorry, but he isn't feeling very fit." "And Moll?" "Same, apparently." Everyone was discussing the peculiar happening. Somehow, by supper-time, it was known that the entire pack had been destroyed. It was incomprehensible, for the master was known everywhere for his fatherly tenderness to the hounds. However, the dance went merrily on. The band was voted a good one. At 2 o'clock in the morning, Pops Russell and 3 of his pals were drinking in the bar. The middle-aged secretary was drinking his 13th bottle of Bass. "What's the mystery, Pops?" asked Naps Spraycombe, MFH in another county. "Rioted," replied Captain Russell, staring at the lethargic bubbles rising to the flattened froth halfway down his glass. He was an honest man who disliked subterfuge, but he had to lie. "I suppose it's bound to get known anyhow. Won't do hunting any good." With a sudden movement he emptied his glass. "Don't tell anyone I told you. Rioted after sheep. Bimbo's poisoned 'em, every dog and every little bitch. Cyanide of potassium." "'Struth," drawled Spraycombe. "What about your committee and subscribers?" "That's the very devil of it," muttered the secretary. "I shall have the dirty work of explaining to subscribers. Bimbo's got enemies, and they're not his own hounds, or weren't, I should say. They'll be the very devil if anyone gets nasty." "Was it that run on Monday, when they got lost in the mist?" inquired a young man wearing the uniform of the Lammerton Hunt. Captain Russell nodded. "Put up hare. Changed to a screaming scent up by Link's Tor. Must have been fox, I think. Disappeared into the mist. Jim couldn't find him. Stragglers began to come into kennels about 8 hours after. Moll heard 'em in Tavy Cleeve and saw 'em eating sheep. Every one of 'em eating. Once get the flavour of hot mutton and it's all up with your chance of catching fox or hare. Myself, I believe it was that damned donkey flesh." Next day, the West Country Morning News published a statement, displayed prominently, that Major General T.F.M. Inklefell, CMG-DSO, the master of the Inklefell Harriers, had destroyed the entire pack for sheep worrying. It was followed in the issues of succeeding days by an extended correspondence. General Inklefell was accused of acting hastily. He was held blameworthy for the faulty and irregular feeding of hounds in kennels. The incident was amplified into a general attack upon fox and hare and stag hunting. A letter signed W.H. Starcross, Lieutenant Colonel R.E., complained of the expense the writer, quote, "had undergone in bringing hunters to the district, and the enforced dismissal of his 2 temporary grooms in the worst part of the winter, consequent upon the folly of General Inklefell, shown by the needless and callous annihilation of the innocent hounds with the guilty," unquote. The secretary replied, stating that he had searched the army list and his subscribers list, and had been unable to find the name of W.H. Starcross in either. This surprised everyone except the writer of the letter, an 18-year-old youth named Cox, a mechanic to an unqualified dentist, whose hunting experiences were confined to 1, stalking lovers in the summer evening fields, and 2, stamping mice to death during the threshing of a corn-rick in his uncle's farmyard. There were letters from Not a Nut-Eater, who wrote about the, quote, appalling danger of rabies via the butcher shop, unquote, from Dog Lover, who wrote, quote, on behalf of poor little dogs who cannot defend themselves, unquote, from Only a Schoolgirl, quote, we of the upper fifth have had a debate, and we have decided to let it be known that it was a jolly rotten thing to kill hounds. 2 blacks never yet made a white was our unanimous conclusion, unquote. And from indignant butchers in Plymouth, answering the allegations of not a nut-eater, and various others, some funny, some silly, but all based upon ignorance. Every letter was read in the West Country Club with great interest and often amusement, except by the uneasy Captain Russell, the secretary of the Packless Hunt. His ruddy face appeared every day for its morning basses, which were drunken as usual under the stuffed badger in the case above the fireplace. Often he declared that he wasn't interested in what was said, and as often he spent the morning morosely interested in what was said. He knew the main facts about the run in Moorland fog, as told by a pale Molly Inklefell to her father in the evening of the disastrous Monday, and they were quite different from the explanation given at the extraordinary general meeting a few days later. It was remarked that the master had looked positively uneasy when Valentine Potstacker got up on his hind legs and demanded the name of the farmer to whom compensation would be paid for the loss of sheep by worrying. The master said that he would personally investigate and settle all claims. Major Potstacker, a lawyer employed by a clique of subscribers, repeated that he would very much like the meeting to know the name of the farmer who had lost sheep by worrying. The master replied, in a voice weary but courteous, that the Scotch sheep on the moors roamed at large, that some time must elapse before any loss could be discovered. Major Potstacker, following his line, suggested that all claims that were to be made had been notified already. The secretary then got up and said that surely everybody except the only non-subscriber present had been able to grasp what the master had just told the meeting, that the committee would be called upon to examine no claims whatsoever in respect of sheep worried by the pack. And further, he himself as secretary would announce that the master, whom he understood was about to offer his resignation to the committee, which in passing he would say he hoped would not be accepted, he meant to say the master, one of the best of sportsmen, had told him that he would furthermore guarantee the cost of a new pack. He sat down, feeling hot. Major Potstacker thereupon said, gently, that he was representing some of the subscribers, and that on their behalf he would like to suggest that the price of new hounds would be the only expense to be borne by the master, and that he would further suggest that the master might possibly have had another reason than the one given for the slaughtering of the hounds. Voices said, "Oh, shut up! Put a curb in his mouth, someone, and sit down, sit down!" Captain Russell jumped on his feet and said, "Mean to say I'm a liar?" Major Potstacker said, "Certainly not, Mr. Secretary. I am seeking information. Now, I see many farmers present, men who call a spade a spade." A quiet voice, "Us calls 'em shovels, meister," and laughter. "Well, shovels. Now, farmers are exact in what they say. They insist on a shovel being called a shovel." And when loud laughter of only the farmers had ceased, Major Potstacker said distinctly, "Who among you lost sheep by worrying last Monday?" He looked round. "No one claims a loss." "Well, then, who among you has counted your sheep?" Many gave an immediate, "Aye, aye." At this point he was called to order and told curtly to address his questions to the chair. "Damn swine," Captain Russell was heard to mutter. Major Potstacker knew that no sheep had been killed. He had been making inquiries, but he had learned only negative information. And after the meeting, although he tried to pump Jim Huggins, he got nothing from him. "Warn't he to the meeting, son?" Jim murmured plainly. "Ah, he missed a rare lot of rattling, but I be dowled if I knows what 'twas all about." Yet even Jim, close and firm as a Wistman oak, didn't know everything. The cracked tenor bell of the church had ceased its franging hum when a man crawled furtively through the garde-robe hole at the base of the wall of Lidford Castle. The four walls of this Norman ruin were open to the stars. The ivy, pushing its roots into the yellow mortar between the hewn granite blocks and inner rubble, shook with the exploring winds. The crumbling hollow square stood upon a motte or raised mound of earth. For centuries it had been used as a stannery prison, but now its dungeon was fallen in. Brambles grew where men had lain in chains. Owls and jackdaws cried around the walls by night and day. In the northeastern wall of the keep was a mural chamber built for hiding in an age of violence. It was dilapidated, the home of grass and nettles. Stalks and blades were broken and bent. Some blades were raising themselves, for the man who had been hiding in the wall all that Sunday, shivering and sometimes groaning, had just climbed along the ledge and jumped down. He was peering through the garde-robe hole. Once he had a name. He still bore the name, but it was never spoken on any lips except his own. To have heard other men speaking the names bestowed upon him with pride and tenderness at his christening would have been to him warning of a calamity more terrible to anticipate than death. For he was one of the most wretched of breathing things, a convict escaped from Princeton. The number of his cell had been 76. He was known to the warders as 76, the warders to whom it was forbidden to speak unless he were asked a question. He was 76, a corrupted animal that for years had quarried stone for other men's buildings, dug turf for other men's fires, sewn bags for other men's letters, had his hair cropped, his chin shaved, worn khaki clothes marked with the possessive broad arrow of His Majesty's government. An animal, not wild and pure, but with rot in its mind, that had done with life, but with which life had not yet done. He was godless. The castle ruin was remembered from a happy visit from Plymouth just before the Great War, when he had been on his honeymoon. From August 1914, when he had jacked up his job and stood for hours before a recruiting office, hoping with his pals to be sent off to fight before the fun was ended, until his escape the day before, he had had practically no sense of time. He had exchanged one number of military servitude for another of penal servitude, with only one period of tentative freedom, when he had murdered a man and a woman. Now he had another interval of freedom. The day before, 76, who was serving a commuted death sentence, had dropped from the scaffolding where he had been working a block of stone on a warder's head and escaped by running through the fog. He had scooped in his hands the icy waters of the moor, drinking on his knees. He had eaten grass. Repeatedly he had touched the hem of his jacket, fearful lest he might have lost his only companion. 76 crept through the hole and listened. A row of larches grew between the castle and the church. The fog was gone, and moisture dripped from the branches. Organ music came with a dim light through the windows of the holy building. People were singing the evening psalms. 76 sneered mentally. After listening, he slunk down the slope of the motte to the larches, jumped softly down a bank, and walked to a gate. Once again he listened, but hearing no footfalls, climbed the gate and crossed the road. He entered the rectory garden, starting from a laurel bush a bird that flew away with shrill, squealing cries of alarm. 76 cursed and touched his jacket again. Reassured by the contact of his index fingertip with the head of what he sought, he crept towards the house, stooping with silent steps on the grass border of the main path. A cautious inspection of the lightless building told him that all the lower windows were secured. He felt along one pane, wondering if he dare risk the noise of putting his elbow through it. While he was hesitating, he heard above the thudding of his heart the voices of men in the village street. He hurried away, going down a steep slope among spruce and larch trees where it was very dark but safe. The river roared below in the gorge. He turned to the left and walked on, often blundering into ants' nests as tall as himself and mossy wet trunks of trees. He bruised his head, and a sudden mood of happiness came upon him. The wood was thinner by a viaduct with arches that spanned the gorge. A thought came to him that it would be easy to climb the embankment and lay his head on the rail and end it all. But while he waited, a train thundered above him. Sparks rained into the dark gorge. He was still free, but so hungry. 76 choked back a desire to cry and walked on. The path was rough with shillets and led down to a cottage before which were scattered bits of paper and empty tins. Washed underwear, some of it ragged, was thrown on a hedge in front. He scrounged 2 shirts and a pair of trousers, hanging with the lining inside out. He chucked one shirt back on the hedge, thinking that the bloke as owned it was a poor man. An abandoned watermill stood near the footbridge, with broken roof and walls, and he was about to explore when he heard a man's voice above the rushing sounds of the river. Thinking that the owner of the clothes had discovered the loss, 76 crossed by the footbridge. He had stepped down to the path on the other side when he saw the glow of a cigarette in the darkness above him. Someone was coming down the path through the wood. He crouched on the earth, hiding his face, and felt about for a stone or stick. The voice spoke again, high and eager, and of the quality that 76 had often laughed at when coming from the lips of music-hall comedians before the war. The red point came near, and now a girl was speaking. 76 listened to the first feminine voice he had heard since his trial at the Old Bailey. "What fun, I say! But I say, you mustn't ever let Daddy know we did it." "Rather not. I feel rather a rotter to have done it, really, without his knowing. Of course he doesn't hunt, but after all I'm his guest. He's on the committee, too." They stopped by the bridge. "Shall we do it, Bid? Or shall we go up to the village and make a present of it to old Atters? It's damned heavy to carry." "Oh, let's do it. Daddy will laugh when he hears," persuaded the girl. "He doesn't like Captain Russell for killing all the badgers, but he didn't like to say anything as the farmers wanted them killed." "The farmer was probably thinking of the free drinks next month at the Badger Club supper," said the young man scornfully. "And he probably believes they do harm, as Russell says they do, the fat liar. The other day I heard him telling someone in the West Country Club that he had dug out 130 pounds of badger flesh from one holt. His very words. Whereas 2 labourers did the digging, 3 terriers got bitten, 1 a broken jaw, and all the work he did was sometimes to kneel at the hole, thrusting down an ear to hear what was happening, and then to tootle-too on a copper horn with what little beery breath he possessed after his athletic feat of kneeling. Pah! And, of course, he stabbed the poor brocks when someone had banged them on the nose with a shovel." "Pah!" said the young girl delightedly. "He calls that sport." The man's eager voice spoke as they were moving away. "You know, Bid, it would be a great scene when hounds leave the hare's line and crash off down to the marsh, and when Russell and the rest of them arrive at the holt and find hounds at dinner." The conversation was meaningless for 76, except the word dinner. He allowed them to get a safe distance ahead of him before following along a footpath under trees beside the river. He climbed a wooden fence, dropped down to a single plank over a ditch, and followed away from the river and up a path which lay on the rock past a waterfall that thundered white in the darkness, and on to grass again. Half an hour later he was trying to find what they had been hiding on the side of a hillock above the marshy ground by the river. The word dinner had so filled his mind while he had been staring in the direction of the voices that he was convinced they had been hiding food. Reasons for the concealment of food did not occur to him. He stooped among the furze and bracken to get the dinner that was waiting for him, if only he could find the right place. His forehead knocked a thorny branch, and he was rubbing the pain away when he fell into a hole, where immediately he smelled a strong smell. Wondering if it led to a cave where he might hide by day, he felt with his hands. Chopped roots stuck out of its sides and roof. It led about 6 feet into the gravelly earth. At its end the tunnel narrowed and was blocked by something soft. He pulled out a heavy bundle and unwrapped the cloth around it to feel a cold, smooth object with a rough covering. It was a pie. 76 pushed his thumb through the crust and tasted. He tore off the pastry and pulled out a handful of meat. He crammed it into his mouth, swallowing without chewing, gulping with dry wheezings in his throat. He muttered and thought phrases like, "Gaw, blimey, mate, you're in luck, and stuff to give 'em." The food gave him sharp pains, and he went to the river to drink. When he returned, he ate less quickly. It was a steak and kidney pie flavoured with onions and hard-boiled eggs. The gravy was rich, tasty with salt and pepper. The dish was big, holding enough for a dozen men. When he had eaten his fill, he again felt about the place. It ended in a tunnel too small for him to crawl into. He found a pair of light walking boots with rubber pads fixed on the soles. With them were the skin of an animal stuffed with straw, a coat, and a bowler hat. The smell he had noticed when he found the hole was thick on the skin. It dimly recalled the pain of caned hands in boyhood. Some hours later, wandering on the lower heather slope of the moor, he found a hiding place under an oblong slab of granite. It was sealed on all sides save one, by which he entered. Low-growing furze and heather and whortleberry formed a springy door. He crawled out again and tore with difficulty handfuls of heather from the sodden ground, while a herd of small, wild, grazing cattle stared and sniffed near him. A wan white moon gleamed above low clouds moving over from the southwest. 76 made his bed and placed in a far corner the dish with its life-making food. He wore the khaki arrow-marked clothes no longer. At first he had hidden them in the pillaged badger holt, but cunning had made him pull out the bundle and, going back the way he had come, drop it, boots and all, in a waterfall of the gorge under the viaduct. But before discarding his prison clothes, he had withdrawn something from his jacket and placed it in the hem of the new coat. To 76, warm and happy, came the old thoughts he had had just before his marriage, when one Sunday night he had listened idly, his girl on his arm, to a street preacher, and believed what he had heard. He recalled another preacher before whom the battalion had been marched and formed into a hollow square, and ordered to lie down while the chaplain stood up and preached. The old sweats had said afterwards that they were for it again because the padre had talked about God being on their side, which he always did just before a show. The words were realized now by 76 for the first time since that September church parade before Luce in 1915. God saved sinners. God had arranged for the pie to be hid there. He sat on the granite slab and said, "God blimey," which was the vocal accompaniment of his poor, darkened spirit's aspiration. He did not really pray to be blinded. A rising wind stirred the heather, and curlew cries were blown across the sky. 76 thought, "God, please go on helping me." Then he drew out from the hem of his coat the thing he cared for more than anything on the earth, and played with it. It had been with him through his trial. He tossed it a few inches into the air and caught it lightly between finger and thumb. He had played like this in his cell for hours, often watched by warders. It had shared his hopes for a better life, for 76 was still young enough to hope for a happier future. So acquainted was he with the ways of his companion that 76 could jerk it up and catch it again in the dark. He caught it by his front teeth and, biting onto its head, nicked it with a forefinger. It made the least musical note, which was as a loved voice comforting him. It fell, and he trembled. His throat was dry until he found it. How glad he was when it pricked his finger and he picked it up and put it in its place. It was an ordinary pin made of brass, the bright plating of which had long since worn off. 76 crawled into the refuge and fell into a deep sleep before he had tucked in his legs. All night the rain was driven slantingly upon his boots. An old dog-fox trotted down to where he lay, made curious by the strange scent carried upward to Link's Tor, where it had been seeking beetles. 3 stoats visited the boots during the night, and when the rain ceased at daylight, a pair of ravens, flying to the moor from their rocky fastness in the gorge, dipped from a height of 200 yards to inspect the yellow things in the heather. After much flapping of wings and dipping of beaks over the granite slab, one dared to alight. With sidling walks and glances of little eyes and uneasy hops into the air, it made a swift lunge with its beak, ripping a toe-cap. A grunt came from under the stone, and the ravens departed, fearing a trap. They were puzzled, as the fox and stoats had been, at the unfamiliar taint in the air. A few hours later, the Inklefell harriers met at the Dartmoor Inn. A small field was present, about 24 in the saddle, including farmers. Miss Molly Inklefell stood talking to Jim Higgins, the huntsman. She was a slight, fair girl, wearing black coat and breeches. 6 motor cars had brought people. The squire was there, on foot with his sons and daughters. With them was a young man who hid a nervous restlessness under an assumed lack of interest in the meet. When the huntsmen took hounds to a certain brake of bracken where a hare was usually to be found, the youngest daughter of the squire set off with her companion at a tangent from the curve made by the mounted and foot followers. When over the brow of the slope they started to run. Unseen, they crossed the river lid by leaping on boulders. Quickly they climbed up the other slope. The 2 friends were making for high ground, whence the old badger holt might be seen. For a quarter of a mile they climbed in sunlight, and then they sat down on an oblong block of granite embedded in heather. They had been sitting down less than a minute when hounds far away and below gave tongue. A hare had been started from its form. The high voice of Jim Higgins sang faintly in the wind. They watched the hare making a right-handed turn toward the field of flat-pole cabbages behind the Dartmoor Inn. The hare sped away from the leading hounds. They watched it crossing the place where the previous afternoon the young man had taken off his brogues and pulled from a haversack a pair of yellow boots. Suddenly, hounds checked. They clamoured. They pushed their muzzles together so that they looked like a great fungus suddenly grown on the moor, only to break up into fragments that streamed along a new line. They overran the place where the hare had branched and raced along the crest of the hill above the stream. The extended field cantered behind. When the young man turned to speak to the girl standing a few yards away, he was startled by her white cheeks. She was staring at something near. Following her gaze, he saw the pair of boots which he had imagined to be with other things in the badger holt. The boots were covering the sockless feet of a hidden man. The girl whispered, "Oh, it may be the escaped convict." The young man stared at the boots again and said, "Oh, my God!" Then he leapt through the heather and clutched one of the heels. His hand was kicked away. "Come out, I say," he said quickly. "There isn't a moment to be lost." "Who are you?" snarled a voice. "On my honor, I won't hurt you," cried the other, certain that the man was the escaped convict. "You're wearing the boots I hid in the badger holt. It was meant for a joke. I really should advise you to clear off as soon as possible." He was deeply alarmed and had tried to talk in an ordinary voice to reassure his companion. She was a nervous and imaginative girl, but recently recovered from scarlet fever. "Why can't a bloke have a bit of a kip if he wants to?" threatened the voice. And then, "If you tries any monkey tricks, I'll bash you straight, I will." "Please come away, please," implored the trembling girl, looking at her companion. The baying of the pack grew fainter as hounds sank the hill to the holt 2 miles away. After more persuasion, the man came out, clutching a piece of granite in his left hand. He wore a pair of labourer's trousers with the lining on the outside, a grey shirt, a Lovett tweed jacket, and a grey bowler hat. The wan blue eyes of his ruined face looked about him with such an ailing wildness in them that the young man felt he had to deal with a madman. "Don't be alarmed, I say," he said, aghast and smiling. "Look here, you ought really to clear off as quickly as possible. In about 10 minutes or less, hounds may be running your line. I laid a drag yesterday with those boots you've got on now. Wherever you've been walking, they may follow. Now, if you'll only run to Link's Tor over there on the skyline, you'll find a narrow crack in the granite up which you can climb to the top. It's hard to get up the chimney, but once there you'll be safe until they can whip hounds off. Look here, I'll follow you and give you £1 for the trouble you've had through my damned foolishness. And I'll give you my word I won't breathe a word to anyone that I've seen you. After all, I haven't the least idea who you are, and it's none of my business. I mean, not my affair who you are. Now go, as quick as you can." 76, having been born and bred in a Bermondsey slum, had never seen a live hound in his life. He looked at the summit of Link's Tor. "Climb up on a skyline to be sniped at, eh? Not a hope. See any green in my eye?" The young man said earnestly, "Well, look here. Change boots. I've got you in this mess, and I can run, but—" "All right, Bid, don't worry. But it wouldn't be any good unless you hide that jacket." "Clear off, there's a good fellow. Oh, my God, do hurry. Look, they're running to the badger holt." The girl never forgot the look in the convict's eyes. She was unable to cry. She was fixed as though in a nightmare. The face became set in her mind as a symbol not of human spoliation and despair, but of cruelty and evil. She knew nothing of war. She heard him mutter something as he flung the granite lump at the face of her companion, who groaned and dropped into the heather. She could not breathe. She heard hounds in the distance and thought, "Come soon, come soon." She watched the blood beginning to run from the purple mark on his forehead. She was dizzy and sick, and vaguely realized that the man was ramming her father's old otter-hunting hat on his head as he ran. The hillside seemed to slide up the sky. Long before he reached the Tor, 76 had to use his hands to aid him. After splashing and slipping through soggy ground, he came to a clitter of rocks overgrown with turf and mosses. A holly had its roots in a granite crevice, a tree twisted and hoary with lichen and without a red berry among its spineless leaves. The holly grew near a mountain ash. Both had been planted by birds. Looking down while holding a branch of holly, 76 could see the toff kneeling by the girl, and below them the river at the base of the hill. He neither saw nor heard hounds, for they were running down the unseen slope which led from the marshy ground. Beyond the marsh, on the opposite hillock, was the badger holt. He climbed the clitter and went at a steady pace onwards. Here was drier ground that dipped gradually to a saucer-like depression rising to Link's Tor about a mile away against the sky. Being under the everlasting wind, the heather was knee-deep and springy. There were no rocks to hinder. The flagpole on Hare Tor to the south, erected to give the signal when gunners were firing on the artillery ranges, lost its dark outline in a drift of cloud as he began to ascend again. 76 began to hear the wind as he climbed toward Link's Tor. From a sighing in the stalks of heather it swelled to a chilly whistling, and his clothes were blown against his form. About 50 yards from the summit, where was lodged a squat, roundish mass of black granite, grooved and scalloped and smoothed by wind and rain of 1,000 centuries, he sat down and rested. Turning in a northerly direction, he saw a great brown and grey ball of a hill, at whose base ran the leaden vein of the Lid. He looked across the great Nodden to fields in sunlight and shadow, and away to a blue infinity of land and sky. The south was dim and grey. Rain. 76 was glad, for it would hide him. He thought that he would strike inland to the moor behind him and hide till dusk, when he would return and make for the sea. As he became hopeful again, he felt sorry that he had slung the brick at that young toff. It had been done in fear. A sudden deep croaking over his shoulder made him turn his head. He was in time to see black cart-wheeling wings as a bird swerved and dropped out of sight behind the tor again. The raven had meant to alight there, but something had disturbed it. As 76 stared, he saw a thin object like a stick thrust up from the centre of the granite. It thickened towards its end, and then it disappeared. In its place was an arm, followed by a head and shoulders. The man levered himself upon the platform, picked up his rifle, and staggered to his feet, his legs crooked as he braced himself against the icy blast of the wind. 76 tried to force his head back to its normal position, but it was held there as though by a spring fixed to his spine. He continued to stare at the crooked figure on Link's tor. He had to stiffen the muscles of throat and neck before he could force his head away. He sat rigidly, wondering when he would be shot in the back. He waited until the feeling in his spine compelled him to twist his head again. The warder had dropped on one knee and was covering the convict with his rifle. 76 pretended not to have seen him. The curiosity of dread made him turn round once more, just as a shout, enfeebled by wind, came from the warder. He was beckoning 76, standing as upright as the wind would permit, and holding the rifle in his right hand at the position of trail. 76 got on his feet, and while he was walking towards the tor, the warden pulled a whistle from his breast pocket and blew a long blast. As though in answer, a ragged edge of mist trailed in cold silence past the convict and washed around the monolith of granite. Link's tor faded out, but the whistle continued its double note in the fog. "76 stood irresolute. He felt for the head of the pin. The touch of its head was like a double dose of rum before going over the bags. He laughed and was turning it in finger and thumb when a hound spoke below. It was the leader, a dog named Lamplight. The pack was less than a mile away, running the line of the yellow boots, whose scent was pungent in the mist. Again, 76 thought of being caned on his hands before the boys and girls of the 5th standard of the council school. He remembered the bag of aniseed balls which he had been made to throw in the master's waste paper basket, his mother's birthday gift bought with one of her scanty spare pennies. And afterwards the master had made him face the class and had used the little boy's tearful gulping for a crudely sarcastic lecture on the subject of heroism. He had not known that a son felt that his mother's heart was thrown in the basket. 76 thought, "This fog is a bit of all right. Stuff to give the troops." He set off at a run on his toes. He had been the champion runner of his battalion. The moor was a chaos of whitey grey, cold and dim. Soon his eyelashes were damp. The ground was firm, and he leapt over the ling. The rubber pads gave a good grip. After a quarter of an hour his breath came quickly, and he felt a relief when the ground began to slope down. The noise of water was before him. Lower and lower he descended until he came to the Rattle Brook, fretting its stony bed. He crossed without wetting his feet, and listened. In front of him the ground rose again, and a remote baying seemed to float down through the mist. He pushed on up the hill, but was forced to rest at the top. He imagined that as he was invisible he was safe, because he did not know that hounds followed by nose alone. As he lay on a couch of ling, he heard them giving tongue, not an echo this time. They had reached the unseen crest of the coombe. He jumped up and hastened onwards, cursing them because he thought they would betray him to the warders. The clamour suddenly increased, where 76 had rested, and he ran on again. His next rest was half an hour later, when he flung himself by a thread of a stream which had cut for itself a channel in the peaty soil. He dipped his hat in the brown water, flinging it over his face and washing out his mouth. In the old running days, when the Guards division had been out of the line, he had been trained never to drink before or during a long-distance run. He lay on his back, wishing he had a pal with him. 1 minute, 2 minutes, 3 minutes, and then the baying of hounds. Patches of ling and grass tufts became scantier. Everywhere was water. The rubber soles of his boots often slid. He ran flat-footed over a maze of water threads. An idea came to him that he must jump them all, that he would have bad luck if he slipped into one. To ease himself, he carried the hat in his left hand. It began to impede him, but he dared not throw it away, as he would need it until his hair grew. It hindered more when carried under an arm, so he rammed it on his head again. During the next half hour, toiling up a long hill, he changed its position more than a dozen times. Eventually the hat was thrown away, beside a layer of turves that had been cut and laid in wide arrow-shaped lines to drain and dry, where it was found long afterwards. Disturbed in their feeding, 3 golden plover rose in the mist before the runner, with swift anchor-winged flight and with gentle cries of alarm. Snipe, thrusting long bills into the soft ground, were driven up from their feeding. Sometimes a raven croaked over his head. He was so fatigued when he reached the great knee set that he had to walk. His feet, with blistered toes and heels, felt as hot and heavy as they had felt when he had trench feet, swelled and red as tomatoes. He flung away the stolen shirt, soggy with sweat, on the morass where the river Tavy rises. His trousers to the knees were wet and black with peat. He had blundered into many shallow bogs. The deep, sucking quakers, which shook and rippled at his passing, were bright green and easily seen. He staggered across the plash in the peaty hollow of an old tarn, hid by swirls of fog. A broken spade was stuck into a heap of turves in the hollow, and in the turves was an iron box holding a metal stamp, a bottle of violet ink, and a book wherein many names were signed. Its flyleaf was ringed and smudged by intersecting violet circles holding the letters Cranmere. 76 remembered. Past and present were mingled as reality in his confused brain. In the early summer of 1914, a London-born youth and his wife on their honeymoon had scrawled their names across a page with the remark, "It's all right." And now, nearly 10 years later, the mortal remains of the woman moulded in a South London graveyard, and neither age nor name mattered further for the husband. 76, grey-haired, was resting the weight of his head and shoulders on forehead and knees, but a younger man in khaki was writing a letter to a wife still living. "Dear Doll, I write hoping you are quite all right, as it leaves me at present in the pink. Are you getting the spiration allowance all right? I hope so. We are not allowed to say where we are, but it isn't so bad, although a bit of mud about. I hope to get Blighty Leaf soon. It is my turn soon, and I hopes the Sergeant Major don't forget. No more now from your loving husband, Bob. P.S. This war is a bastard." He blacked out the last word, remembering that his officer would read the letter. And SWAK on the envelope flap, sealed with a kiss. The pencil stump, paper, and sand-bagged traverse, sun-shining, plank he sat on, all dropped into darkness. He heard the whining of ricochets, saw the greenish flares quivering in the water-filled shell-holes as the relieved right-wing company filed down the wooden track to the Menin road. Jerry's machine guns were clacking from many points. Going out at last! Rest billets reached and rum in tea dished out. The SM was calling out names for Blighty Leaf. Christ, how his heart thumped! His own number! His name! He saw again the lorry in which he had hopped to railhead after 14 months in the mud of Artois and the shallow, watery trenches of the salient. During the slow journey in the train, clanking and stopping and jerking on again past sandhills and pines to Boulogne, the young Coley was singing and shouting, happy at the thought of seeing again the wife he had constantly thought of, but infrequently written to, during so many evenings in smoky estaminets, candle-dim billets, and lousy cubby-holes. A stay of 2 days in the rest camp, owing to submarines in the Channel, and again he was singing with his chums as they marched down the quay. Horse-nosed officer bloke with AMLO on his brassard at the gangway, with red-capped sergeant and 2 policemen scrutinizing the yellow pass. Then the pitch and roll of the boat, the nausea and prostration, the grey cliffs of England, the pulling himself together and the tottering off at Folkestone, the train with the black-painted lamps and drawn blinds, the faces in smoke and the crush of equipment, the glide into Victoria Station, so vast and dark and subdued, yet noisy with feet and engine steam. Outside the women he didn't want to talk to, saying, "Hello, dearie." And then the first drink of good old English beer, a pint of mild and bitter. How strange civvy suits looked. One reality faded, nausea remained. 76 lifted his head and hearkened to hounds following him in the mist. 2 hours before they had streamed over the ragged grass below Link's Tor. They were unfatigued, but had veered off the line, following the aniseed straying in the mist. 76 thought that the warders would see his name in the book and know that he had been past Cranmere. He carried the book away with him and trod it into a bog where it was never found. Afterwards it was indignantly stated that someone had taken it because it contained the autograph of the Prince of Wales. 76 loped on for another half-hour, descending to a coombe where the mist was thinner. He fell over a rock beside a stream and choked as he tried to suck up the water, which turned his teeth to icicles. When he tried to rise again, he had to draw his feet from off the rock. He felt as though he were dragging the rock with them. He prayed with broken shouts, as he had prayed under the barrage at Festubert. His ribs were hugging him to death. The prison shirt was smothering him. He tore it off and left it on the rock and pulled himself onwards as a child in a nightmare. Now he was clad only in trousers and boots, and the Union Jack tattooed on his back. The flag was one of the patriotic relics of 1914, done in a caterer's shop after cheers and beers with pals, following flaring mental hatred of the sergeant instructor drilling the squad to breaking point on the parade ground.